America's founders are often portrayed as champions of a strict separation between religion and government. But their actual assumptions, practices, and political realities tell a far more nuanced story. When it comes to religion and politics in America, most people think the American founders wanted a strict wall between the two. But, as with anything from history, the real story is far more complex and in some ways surprising than we've been led to believe.
I'm intrigued. What makes you say that?
Well, I've been doing a deep dive into this analysis of the Establishment Clause, which is more commonly known as the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which says that Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion. Once you look closely at the political environment of the era, it completely challenges our modern assumptions. The founders indeed wanted a separation between church and state, but they also assumed that Protestant Christianity would remain fundamental to American society and in its government.
That seems like a contradiction. How did they reconcile those two positions?
It really comes down to how they defined church. They weren't trying to create a completely secular society. Now, you could argue that's what we have now, but we'll get to that in a moment. The founders specifically wanted to prevent having an official state church like the Church of England that could dominate and suppress other religious practices.
So they were more concerned about preventing religious oppression than removing religion from public life entirely.
Removing? Far from it. The Continental Congress itself would regularly call for explicitly Christian practices. They would declare official days of prayer and fasting. Even in Pennsylvania, the state legislature actually funded the printing of English Bibles when the British cut off the supply before the Revolutionary War.
You know, the 2 pages about the founding era of America in my high school social studies book didn't mention that, but this is so different from how we think about separation of church and state today. What changed?
Well, this is one of those you ask 10 different people and you're going to get 11 different answers type of situations, but let me give you my take on it. The founders' whole framework seemed to have assumed that Protestant Christianity would be the dominant moral framework of American society. I don't know that they ever anticipated how their principles would need to apply in a truly diverse nation like we have today.
So, as America became more diverse, their original framework started breaking down?
That could very well be. There's always been an unspoken tension between the church in America and the political establishment, meaning to what degree should the church exert any influence on the state. A lot of people don't know that public schools were actually intended, very subtly, mind you, to marginalize the Catholics who had immigrated to America. The assumption was that the public schools would teach from a Protestant worldview, thus minimizing the Catholic Church's influence on American society. Of course, today, public schools are basically forbidden from even breathing anything with a hint of Christianity, so it's a bit ironic in that way. But this tension came to a head in a pivotal Supreme Court case, Everson v. Board of Education in 1947. The decision of the court is not as important as the fact that the court essentially reconstructed the meaning of the Establishment Clause, based primarily on a single metaphor from a private letter that President Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists in 1802.
What? How could the Supreme Court base such an important constitutional interpretation on a single private letter?
Well, to say that they based the entire decision off of that one letter might be a bit of an overstatement, but the court has showed a notable bias toward the writings of Jefferson and James Madison in opinions regarding cases involving religion in the public sphere. One of my professors, Mark Hall, wrote a law review article in which he points out that the court cited those two about 4 times more than any other founding voices. Madison and Jefferson were not devout Christians. They were the two most likely to favor a strict separation between religion and government. But the Supreme Court has historically cherry-picked from their writings to back up what many scholars believe is a worldview that is heavily biased against religion in general, and Christianity in particular.
That seems problematic from a historical perspective.
I would tend to agree with you. Justice Rutledge actually wrote in his opinion from the Everson case, and I quote, "Thomas Jefferson and James Madison represent the founders. Jefferson and Madison favored the strict separation of church and state. Therefore, the Establishment Clause requires the strict separation of church and state." Unquote. Now, to say that two men represented the entire political class of America's founding era is ridiculous, but there it is. A justice of the U.S. Supreme Court actually said this. Keep in mind, these same founders who approved the First Amendment also allocated funds for things like legislative chaplains and approved legislative prayer. These were not just random acts. They were deliberate decisions that reflected their understanding of the proper relationship between religion and government.
So how do we reconcile these historical contradictions with our modern needs for religious freedom?
That is the million-dollar question. The court's interpretation has essentially created this framework that's much more strictly separationist than what the founders envisioned. And while religious freedom remains an important hallmark of American society, if we look closely at history, I'm not sure that we can say we've come by this freedom honestly.
You know, this really highlights how complex constitutional interpretation can be.
You are absolutely right. The job of interpreting the Constitution is extremely important. A Supreme Court justice knows that his opinion today will become codified law tomorrow. That's what makes it so shocking that Justice Rutledge would be so, and I'm sorry, but that's just laziness on his part in writing that opinion. Either that, or he had a political agenda and he was cherry-picking from history to suit it. That being said, a historical understanding of the Constitution is bound to challenge both conservative and liberal interpretations. Conservatives often overlook the founders' strong opposition to state-sponsored churches, while liberals might not acknowledge how comfortable the founders were with religious expression in public life.
That's such an important point about how these issues often get oversimplified in modern debates.
Hence the 2 pages of your social studies book devoted to America's founding era. You know, the founders were incredibly practical about this issue. They weren't trying to create some perfect theoretical framework. They were responding to real problems that they had seen with state churches in Europe, while still believing that religion played a vital role in maintaining civic virtue.
Looking ahead, how do you think we should apply these insights to our modern challenges with religious freedom and diversity?
I think we need to focus on the principles behind the Establishment Clause rather than trying to literally apply the founders' specific practices. They were trying to prevent religious persecution and ensure religious freedom. Those are the core principles we should be focusing on in understanding the Constitution, be it regarding religion or any other part of our society.
So you're saying we should adapt their principles to our modern, pluralistic society while staying true to their fundamental goals.
Exactly. And maybe that's the real lesson here. We need to be both respectful of our constitutional heritage and realistic about the challenges of applying 18th century principles to 21st century problems. It's about finding that balance between continuity and change.
That really brings everything full circle, from the founders' original vision to our modern interpretations and challenges.
Indeed, and it shows us why these debates continue to be so important. We're not just arguing about history. We're trying to figure out how to protect religious freedom and prevent religious discrimination in an increasingly diverse society. That is the challenge we face today.
Well, alrighty then. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
My pleasure. See you next time. If you enjoyed this episode, you'll find even deeper insights, writings, and resources on my personal website, jamesdnewcomb.com. There you can subscribe to my newsletter, explore my musical projects, and connect with the work behind the podcast. Visit jamesdnewcomb.com and become part of this important work, broadcasting consciously from the outskirts of relevance.